what would you say are the negative trade-offs of mass immigration?
I think it's characteristic of this debate that actually you're not allowing a conversation.
No, you're not
Right?
answering my question. That's all that's happening here. What are the negative trade-offs of mass immigration? That's the only question I'm asking.
I think the negative trade-offs is that unfortunately people like yourself do tend to mobilize these negative racist tropes in order to progress their own individual careers.
This debate is Konstantin Kisin literally making an anti-British far-left historian named Kieran Connell look like a complete fool. It's on immigration, multiculturalism, grooming gangs and the recent riots. And it's just shocking to think our universities are full of angry activists like this guy masquerading as university lecturers. He talks in a calm tone, but his words betray him. He is intolerant of anyone who disagrees with him. He believes he is morally superior and resorts to personal insults when you challenge his arguments, as you've just heard. I was surprised at first and a bit disappointed that Konstantin remained so calm and polite for as long as he did after the guy started accusing him of propagating so-called right-wing tropes to further his own career. If I had been Konstantin, I'd have pointed out he's an activist who is using his academic position to push far-left ideology, and that he's someone who has infiltrated the education system to brainwash students. But Konstantin is incredibly smart, and he didn't need to. He just allowed his opponent to expose himself, which these people always do because they can't help themselves, and their arguments always fall flat in the face of the truth. He refuses to answer straightforward questions put to him. He dismisses grooming gangs and tries to hide those specific cases by saying Britain is a misogynistic society. Apparently, it's wrong to racialise those cases. But that argument gets brilliantly turned upside down by Konstantin. Interestingly enough, though, he gets angry if you don't racialise it, if doing so helps to demonise white men. He said this to another opponent in the same debate.
When you say it shows that racism exists, undoubtedly it does, but is it a racism which goes both ways? Because much of the disorder in Birmingham has actually been allegedly Asian youths targeting whites.
I mean, that's I think a misinterpretation of what actually was going on when communities feel under threat. You know, I asked if you to put yourself in the shoes of a British Muslim who's watching on their social media, on their television screens, day by day, Muslims being targeted. You would want to defend your community, your neighbours, your loved ones. That's something that happened throughout different points throughout the last 50 years.
Disgusting. So when it's Muslim gangs savagely beating white people up, that's justified because that's in self-defence. Among the other countless anti-British tropes you'll hear is mass immigration at 750,000 a year is probably about right, as that is needed to fill jobs. Connell's whole position is the British people have no right to expect British culture to be the dominant culture in their own country. In fact, it is evidence of racism if it is. He wants British culture and traditions replaced by multiculturalism, and that process should be sped up by forced mass immigration. And the British people essentially are getting what they deserve because of the British Empire. That seems to be his argument.
I guess because you've mentioned Birmingham, I have to raise the disorder that has occurred in Birmingham over the last couple of days. I mean, what does that say about your description of Birmingham as a place where multiculturalism's proved it can work?
It says that there's undoubtedly racism in British society, and there has been for an awful long time. I think multicultural Britain has been formed by two opposing processes. One is the stubborn, entrenched presence of racism in myriad forms. We're seeing that play out on our streets over the course of the last week. The other is this organic, bottom-up process, which is this creeping multiculturalism, I sometimes call it, whereby people learn to live to get together on a day-by-day basis. Far from perfect, but it's a process that I think is rarely talked about in the current debate.
When you say it shows that racism exists, undoubtedly it does, but is it a racism which goes both ways? Because much of the disorder in Birmingham has actually been allegedly Asian youths targeting whites.
I mean, that's I think a misinterpretation of what actually was going on when communities feel under threat. I ask if you to put yourself in the shoes of a British Muslim who's watching on their social media, on their television screens, day by day, Muslims being targeted. You would want to defend your community, your neighbours, your loved ones. That's something that happened throughout different points throughout the last 50 years or more.
But violence is not excusable.
Violence is never excusable, of course, but I'm actually very struck by it's interesting how the problem of white racism so often in these debates gets focused on racialized subjects. And I think it's really striking how these questions get turned around rather than focus on the issue, which is, of course, white racism. We instead are asked to either sympathize with white racists or at the same time talk about what's wrong with racialized subjects.
I'm sorry, I've not asked you to sympathize with anyone. I've just raised the fact because you mentioned Birmingham. You are an academic in Belfast. Now, Belfast is itself not a shining example of multiculturalism, is it?
Belfast is, as everyone listening will know, it's got a long history of sectarianism, and so it's a very, very interesting case study in a UK context of a society which has only really begun to be multicultural, as we would call it, at a UK-wide level in the last, I would say, 10 years or so. So it's a very young multicultural society, and it's also got deep-rooted sectarianism as well, which means that there is a real severe problem, I think, with racism in myriad forms, not least because there isn't the kind of familiarity with multiculturalism that cities like Birmingham, London, Liverpool, and elsewhere have.
But my point is the sectarian struggle, the troubles that we've seen have played out over centuries. It has taken centuries to get to the point of a peace process, of people being able to live together. Does this not quote, raise doubts about the oft-made claim that diversity is strength? Because this is a very diverse society which has been very weak for a very long time.
Northern Ireland was, and the south of Ireland, in a broader UK context, Northern Ireland especially, it was a state at war between two different paramilitary organisations in which the British state had a role to play. Presumably, you're not comparing what's going on right now in Britain with what happened in Northern Ireland.
No, I'm not. But I'm making the point that when two very different, well, not very different, but when two contrasting cultures live side by side, as they have done for centuries, there is a potential source of tension there. And it is often said that diversity is strength. That's the fallback cliche of politicians throughout this crisis. But we have experience from history that that's not always the case.
And what you're talking about in the north of Ireland is the legacies of British colonialism. And what you're talking about, I think it's sometimes worth taking a broader perspective as well in these debates around multiculturalism, because likewise, what we're talking about in terms of Britain's drift towards the multicultural is the fact that Britain was once an imperial power who colonised 1/3 of the world's landmass. Yes. And the people who initially moved to Britain from South Asia in the 1930s, 40s and 50s did so because Britain was over there. So, I think it's worth sometimes pausing and taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about the broader historical picture to try and, I think, take some of the charge out of these obviously sometimes quite difficult conversations.
Yeah, but okay, acknowledging the crimes of the past does not make it any easier. Well, I suppose some people would say it would, but it doesn't make it immediately easier to deal with the practical issues of the present of different groups of people living alongside each other and clearly not getting on. And how do you respond to the suggestion that in Northern Ireland, for the first time in many years, Sinn Féin supporters and unionists have actually joined hands over their opposition to mass migration?
I would challenge you to come to Belfast and make that statement and see how it goes down. You have a very, very small minority of people, vastly outnumbered by anti-racist protesters in Belfast. In the neighbourhood where I live, the anti-immigrant racist rioters attempted to march down our road, and they were turned back by local, predominantly white women because they didn't want racists in our community. So no, your analysis is wrong, unfortunately, on that particular point.
Konstantin?
When I came to Britain in 1996, over 90% of the population were white British, yet within my lifetime, they're projected to become a minority in their own country. Would you say that it's racist to be concerned about that?
I think you're just talking about the social reality. I don't think you necessarily need to put labels on it. People are all, we live in one.
If someone says, I don't want my country
race
to become minority white British, is that racist?
Britain doesn't necessarily need to be a white country, and it isn't a white country.
That's not the question I'm asking, with respect. The question is it racist to be concerned about white British people becoming a minority in Britain?
I think, yeah, probably. If pushed, I'd probably say that you along those lines, yes.
But didn't you just say that when communities feel under threat, they have a right to be concerned about that, yet being replaced in your own country, isn't that being under threat?
I mean, have there been many white-owned properties that have had their windows smashed, or have there been many
No,
white
but there
people
have
walking down
been,
the street recently who've
according
been
to some
attacked by
estimates,
people
there
who
have
aren't
been
white?
up to 500,000 young girls and women who were raped by Pakistani and Bangladeshi grooming gangs. Wouldn't you say
Oh,
that's a threat to your community?
but I don't quite understand why you racialize that issue,
Because it was a
given that
racialized
sexual.
issue. It was
Mm,
Bangladeshi Muslims and Pakistani Muslims raping white women because they were white.
I mean, unfortunately, we live in a misogynistic society, and it's a
No.
society where women and
Unfortunately,
girls get
that
abused.
particular community was being targeted by another community, by members of another community.
Unfortunately, I think you're again misunderstanding, misreading what's going on. I think we should all be opposed to misogyny and any violence against women and girls. I don't think there's necessarily an issue or a reason to say this particular group X. I mean, we know all about the problems with sexual abuse that take place on the BBC, for example, and most of those instances have been committed by white people, but we don't often hear about white sexual abusers. So I think that's a dangerous trope to go down. I think you indeed would be on very dodgy.
Well, if you had sat across from a grooming gang victim on several occasions and interviewed them about their experience and heard them say that they were being targeted for being white, then perhaps you might see it differently. But let's move on. It's a universal truth that all policies have positive and negative sides. What would you say are the negative trade-offs of mass immigration?
Just to go back to that point, actually,
No, let's not go back to the point. I'm asking you a different
actually have
question.
conducted numerous interviews
I'm asking
with
you a
people
different
in
question.
that area. And I
Dr.
think
Connell,
what it's
with respect,
characteristic of,
I'm asking you a different question now. What would you say are the negative trade-offs of mass immigration?
I think it's characteristic of this debate that actually you're not allowing a conversation.
No, you're not
you are-
answering my
you are-
question. That's all that's happening here. What are the negative trade-offs of mass immigration? That's the only question I'm
I
asking
think the
you.
negative trade-offs is that unfortunately people like yourself do tend to mobilize these negative racist tropes in order to progress their own individual careers. And I think you see that most clearly actually with politicians. And I think that leads us quite nicely back to where we started, which is that politicians for too long, actually I would argue for over 100 years, have tried to use these kinds of issues, the issues that you've just been raising, as ways of making short-term gains in their own political gains and their own political agendas. And the lesson of the last 100 years is that does not work. It simply opens the doors to further racism, and that I think we can all agree is what we don't want to happen.
Well, we certainly don't want more racism. What would you say is the level of net immigration that would be too much in your opinion? Currently, it's running at about 700,000 a year.
It's an arbitrary statement because how can I predict in 10 or 20 years' time how many immigrants we'll need? It's an arbitrary question.
So currently we have about 700,000. Would you say that that's not enough? Too many? About right?
I think probably right now it's probably about right because you know the huge numbers of shortages there are in the National Health Service, for instance. That's not going to be helped by cutting immigration any further. So I think certainly it's probably about right. But again, it depends on the socioeconomic model that we have in a given moment in time.
Thank you for your time.
Dr.